Hey folks, you may know that I do this all on my own. I collect the content, I do the interviews, I produce it, and I process the audio and I process the video, and I do this all on my own. And I do have to pay for programs for some of this stuff and apps for communicating. And, it costs a little bit of money and it takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And it would be great if you wanted to be a patron at patreon.com/skepticalleftist. I would really appreciate it. And if not, it would be great if you could go to like iTunes or Podchaser or some other pod review site and give me 5 stars or a rating or a review of some kind, something positive, and maybe share the show out with your friends and family, anybody you think would like it. If you think somebody needs a little bit of exposure to like a worker who just happens to also enjoy discussing political philosophy, it would be great if you shared the show around. Everything that you do helps. Hey everyone, I am excited again to bring you a full episode of The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. This time around I have another great interview. I'm talking to Pearson Bolt, host of Coffee with Comrades, and we cover a lot of ground in a fairly short time. I had to cut this down to 45 minutes to fit into the overall show, but if you want the full interview, then you can find the slightly longer version over on the Coffee with Comrades feed that will be out in a few days. Or you can become a patron, or just email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Just tell me you want a copy of the audio or a link to the video, and I will send it to you. After the interview, I have a short section for Ask an Anarchist. I think I'm going to add a bit of a post-conversation video because I'm not exactly happy with the answer that I gave in the moment to Renee's objections to anarchism. Then we have Red Reviews number 8, where Justin and I talk about Richard Wolff's book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. And finally, you get another 15 minutes of Anarchist Reading Corner, where I read an excerpt from the book, The Anarchist Turn. But before I do that, I want to get into some stuff that I've been neglecting. I want to thank all my amazing patrons that have supported my work so far. Thank you to everyone who's been a patron for a long time, and I want to give a special thank you to my newest patrons, Justin Clark, Damien Marie AtHope, and Brandy Kerrigan and Dan Wheatley. I think I've thanked everyone else verbally already, and you can see all their names in the closing of the video. I also really want to thank Justin for all his work on the Red Reviews segment. I think it really adds a level of intellectual rigor to the show and helps bring this whole thing together, this whole project together. I have to thank Damien, who is not only a patron, but also has me on his YouTube show every 2 weeks to chat about whatever. I'll add a link to Damien's channel in the show notes. He's a very cool person and helping me be a better thinker. Also, the new patron Brandy is also the guest in the next episode. It's a very Saskatchewan-centric interview, so hopefully that will be something that you can enjoy and connect to some of the broader discussions that we're having about politics and changing our societies. And while he isn't a patron, I also want to thank my friend Renee for taking the time to talk to me about anarchism and for listening with humility and an open mind, even though he doesn't really agree with my philosophy. And also, I guess I gotta thank Jim, who sent me a donation on my Buy Me a Coffee page. It probably seems like I ask for money a lot of the time, but every dollar that I get helps me spend more time on this project and less time in my car doing deliveries for DoorDash so that I can make extra money. The links for all of that stuff are all of my financial support stuff are in the show notes. or you can find anything for me on my Linktree, which is linktr.ee/skepticalcorey. That will also be in the show notes in case I'll put it at the top so that it's the easiest one to find. If you can't support me financially, a like, a share, or a comment really helps, or you can write a review on the podcast rating platform that you prefer. So I think that's all that I need to mention. So I'll send you over to my interview with Pearson Bolt from Coffee with Comrades. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I talk to a variety of people in order to spread critical thinking, progressive politics, and left-wing philosophy. Today I'm talking to Pearson from Coffee with Comrades. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, dude, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on the program. I'm elated to be here and excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, it's I listen to your show regularly, so it's something that I really enjoy. I like your takes, and I think that you're a person that I can learn a lot from. So,
cheers. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It's always it's a weird thing, you know. Like people, my partner always gives me a hard time because I can't take compliments. I like run out of the room. I flee. And so it's always really nice when people say nice things about the show or about Coffee with Comrades or about me, but I'm always like, what do I say? So thank you. Cheers. Thanks so much for saying those kind words. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's I think an appropriate response.
Yeah. You know? But internally, right? My anxiety is like, poof, fair. Shoots up through the roof.
That's fair.
So it goes.
So I guess, just for starters, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hi, my name's Pearson. I am a professor. I'm working to get my PhD in English, specifically in literature, culture, and media. Cool. I am interested in kind of like utopian studies, but also sort of science fiction and speculative fiction. And I'm also a podcast host. I host Coffee with Comrades, which is how Corey and I connected. And I also write. I'm working on a number of different manuscripts, and I have a published poetry collection. So that's a little bit about me. Oh, and I do like community organizing stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah, for sure.
And what is your political ideology?
Oh gosh, goodness, that's such a hard question. You know, I've always gravitated towards anarchism, although I try to eschew labels just because I think that they tend to be unhelpful. Sometimes, you know, I think they can be helpful for getting people interested in left politics, but I think that once you become entangled into the conversations between like leftists, like between Marxists and anarchists, or between communists and between Trotskyists, or between Marxists and social ecologists, it becomes it almost becomes and I don't say this to like erase the real differences, right? Because a lot of people hear me say this and they're like, that's you're erasing the differences between state communism, and I'm like, yes, yes, that is a fair point, but that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to say is that to me, the thing that you call me or the thing I call myself doesn't matter to me as much as like the actual behaviors and activities in which I engage. Right. And if those are liberatory and egalitarian and focused on anti-racism and anti-fascism and decolonization and ecology, then that's what's kind of important to me, and like what you call me is less important.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
That's not a very satisfactory answer, and we're opening up a whole can of worms, right? You know, like 2 minutes into this fucking thing, but here we are. This is what you asked for, Corey. This is what you get, bud.
Yeah. No, I still often, like, I've shifted the labels that I use, and currently I'm using the label anarcho-communist, right? But yeah,
I would say that's what most closely aligns with my personal values and worldview. that or like social ecology. But like again, it doesn't. I don't.
Yeah. Like it
gets annoying at a certain, because then it's like, are you part of this particular club? It's just like, who fucking cares? What are you doing, right? Like, what are you actively doing in your community or in your workplace to try and improve like the material conditions of poor, working class, marginalized people?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. If you're not actually doing anything, then I guess, what difference does it make what you call yourself?
Right, which isn't to like, which also isn't to like advance like a sort of like an ableist narrative of like, you need to be in the streets, but like It does mean that like there are different roles for people to play, and different people have different threat levels and different assessments of all that. There is something in some way for you to participate to the revolutionary potential of the times in which we are living, and I would say that it's every living, thinking person's obligation to do just that.
For sure. You're not on the right, so
no, not by much to my family's chagrin. I am not even remotely anywhere on the right.
Yeah, I spend entirely too much time arguing with my 70-year-old father about this.
Oh goodness, yeah, my dad. You know that the meme. There's like a huge like joke running thread on Twitter because somebody had written like an article about how like, no, Ayn Rand is actually the new hip person that you should be reading, not Karl Marx. Karl Marx isn't who you think he is. You need to be reading Ayn Rand. And like a bunch of people were dunking on it. My father, bless his heart, love him to death. My father literally said to me the other day, Pearson, I think you just need to read Ayn Rand. And I'm like, Dad, I've read Ayn Rand. Like I know what she says, and I fundamentally disagree with her.
What year is this?
It was just like it was. I don't know. Again, love my dad, bless his heart. Don't agree with his politics, and I don't think he agrees with mine, and that's fine.
Yeah, no, that's right. I reading Ayn Rand. It's like 2010, 2011.
Right. Yeah.
So that's around when I was reading that.
Yeah. Yeah. I had to read Atlas Shrugged in my freshman year English class, which it was back in like 2006. I'm dating myself here. And then I read, what was the other big one? Not Atlas Shrugged. The Fountainhead. And I read The Fountainhead, and then I read Anthem, and I was like, all right, this person has literally nothing to say to me. Like I don't like, I was just like, I'm done. I've read the three big novels. I'm done.
Yeah, that's right. There was a time like I came out of conservatism myself when I hit my 30s ish. So then I was kind of on the edge with libertarian anarchism kind of stuff.
Sure.
And so I thought, well, everybody seems to hate Ayn Rand. Maybe I should read her and they'll get something out of it. I did not get anything out of it.
There's nothing redeemable there. The only thing that is even remotely interesting about Ayn Rand is the fact that she's this thing that people use as a cudgel to to essentially tell people this is the book that you should read in high school because it'll show you how great rugged individualism is, right? You know, and it's no, actually, the book doesn't do that. It's very polemic. It's very preachy. She has a lot of her writing, and trust, I would know as fucking English professor, right? She has a lot of all these weird idiosyncrasies that are kind of these weird hiccups in her writing style that just grind my gears. Anyways, I could shit on Ayn Rand all day, but I doubt that's why you invited me on.
It wasn't the initial reason. Yeah, it's fun, but it wasn't the initial reason.
Sure.
What got you started on Coffee with Comrades?
I like coffee and I like Comrades.
That's fair.
I mean, I do like those things, but poor jokes aside, I actually wasn't the person who came up with the idea. It was my friend Bree who initially founded the podcast with me, and she's like, Pearson. We were sitting in her house one day, drinking coffee, as is so often the case. She's like, Pearson, you should start a leftist podcast. And this was God, almost over 3 years now. So it was when it was like the thing to do, right? Not that it's really diminished in being the thing to do, but like it was definitely like the thing to do. And I was like, fuck yeah, let's do it. One thing led to another, and Bree eventually left the show. I had another co-host briefly, and now it's just kind of a solo thing. But it started as a way to have like conversations with folks who are trying to, like I said earlier, improve their communities and try and make the world suck a little bit less. And so over the time, it's evolved into a cool little way of getting to have awesome conversations with really neat people like yourself that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to have, right? So like talking with authors and musicians and scholars and community organizers and saboteurs and occupiers and people who are engaged in militant direct action, but also talking with like friends about like political theory or talking about movies or video games that are interesting to consider from like a left perspective. Like it's kind of just an opportunity to have really cool conversations, and the whole vibe is like, my hope is that it's almost as if you walk into a coffee shop, see two of your friends sitting across like the bar, and then you go over and listen to their conversation that they're having. That's kind of like what I hope it kind of is simulated as.
Yeah, I think that's a good description of it. I appreciate like the podcasting medium because I've always gotten to speak to people who are way more educated than I am. I've been a laborer for 20 years, so it's nice to hear people who have spent some time like actually studying things instead of just working.
Yeah, but I think it's both, we have this often misunderstood phrase that we say on Coffee with Comrades a lot, which is fuck theory, do shit. And and people are like they get fixated on the second part, and it's a particular type of online leftist who gets mad about it, but they're like, you have to read theory. Theory is so good and rich and good. And I'm like, yeah, I fucking love. Have you listened to this program at all? Like, we literally talk about that stuff all the time because it's super interesting. Like my minor, and granted it's literary theory, but like my minor field of study in my PhD is like literary theory. I'm a fucking theory nerd. I love that shit. But I also think that it's just as important to engage in like action and to like be in a workplace and to talk with your coworkers and to participate in militant action, right? I think that both of those things are dialectically interlinked and that they're inseparable, and that the focus on one at the cost of the other is myopic and foolish. And like I said, I think that's the whole reason why it's fuck theory, do shit, is because both it's fuck theory, but it's also the thing that you're doing is shit, right? So like it's supposed to be a joke, and I will probably it's probably not especially well worded, but so be it.
No, that's all right though. I mean, everybody's got little things like that.
Yeah.
I guess we have like a bunch of things that we could talk about. I wanted to ask you. One of the first messages I sent to you about collaborating, you replied to, you wanted to make sure that I wasn't a swerf.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And I've been encountering a lot of sex worker exclusionary stuff in my travels lately in left spheres. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I guess part of it is that there has been a recent resurgence of both swerfs and TERFs trying to infiltrate like leftist circles. And I think that I'm using the word infiltrate very consciously because I think a lot of those people who have those beliefs would say that they are leftists first and that they're not trying to infiltrate anything. But I'm using the term infiltrate because to make it my position perfectly clear, sex work exclusionary feminism or like trans exclusionary feminism is a right-wing position, right?
Yeah, that's reactionary politics.
It is reactionary politics. And to have it being talked about and given space in leftist circles, especially by people whom I really respect and admire and care about, both as like, as people who I think are, creating interesting content or having interesting conversations or like, engaged in meaningful community organizing work in their own communities. At the same time, those people are also like people who I love and who I would call friends. And so seeing them entertaining this and giving it space is really dispiriting for me. And I'm not, here to cast stones or
sure.
name names, but it is very discouraging to me. And so it's something that I have absolutely zero tolerance or patience for, that I have reached out in private to talk with people about, because it's something that really concerns me. And I don't see it as a comradely disagreement amongst people who are on the left. I see it as a reactionary ideology trying to make inroads to prominent leftist platforms. And that's scary to me, that this kind of thing would be entertained.
Yeah, I'm on the same page, but I'm always trying to be like, I want to be super careful, right? Because every time recently I've been accused of being, a patriarchy, upholding the patriarchy, being part of the rapey male type who wants to just use sex workers, and that's why I'm arguing for them. And it's just so I'm trying to be as careful as I can when I'm having these conversations to make sure I'm talking about labor rights and make sure I'm talking about decriminalization. And, I don't want to enhance anybody trafficking,
Of course not. No, and no sex worker wants to increase like human trafficking by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the false equivocation of saying that all sex work is actually sex trafficking is not only anti-materialist, but it's also incredibly chauvinistic and sort of like paternalistic in this weird way where it's like, I know what's better for you, sex worker, than you actually do. Right. And I don't ever want to be in that position for anyone, whether it's a decolonization struggle, whether it is a fight against a pipeline, whether it is folks trying to struggle for the abolition of the police. Far be it from me to ever say this is the way that it needs to be done, and if you're not doing it, then this is the correct or right way of doing it. Like that to me reeks of a certain sort of authoritarian tendency and a sort of chauvinistic and paternalistic attitude that I just find reprehensible and unproductive in any way, shape, or form. I think that from all the conversations that I've had with friends and comrades who also happen to be sex workers, like they would be the first and most ardently, adamantly opposed to human trafficking. Right. And so to somehow insinuate that those two things are the same is disingenuous, myopic, and just foolish.
Like you say, I try to take my cues from comrades who are sex workers. And I read the book, Revolting Prostitutes.
Great book.
Great book. And I think that it's very informative, and maybe some of the people who are promoting swerve shit should maybe read it. I guess the last thing that I'll say on the issue, just because, again, I don't work in that industry, and so I don't want to belabor the point too terribly much. But I guess the last thing that I will say is that, if we're going to have meaningful conversations about decriminalization and about sex work in general, we should probably be having those conversations with sex workers. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
That's just, again, I'm not trying to throw shade. I'm not trying to name names. I'm just saying that is probably a really important thing, is that those, the people who are actually affected by the industry should be the people leading those conversations. Yeah. That's it.
And there are voices out there that you could listen to. It's not you have to go searching too deep to find them. Exactly.
Yeah, they're readily available. And they would be happy to talk about it, Yeah. So it's frustrating. But you see the same thing with TERFs. And I think that particular position is a little bit less insurgent on the left, but it's definitely gaining popularity. It's the new like form of homophobia, right? Like, right. And of course, like, you know, that's not to say that transphobia hasn't existed before, or hasn't been as virulent in the past as it is now, but that it's taking on a very different type of concentrated, legislative, policy focused form of attack that I think is not only incredibly conspicuous, but is also very coordinated.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it plays on the fears of like regular people who might be ignorant about trans people as well, right? Like,
it's done in a way to try and reach out to the base common denominator, and to exacerbate divisions of misunderstanding, of fear of the unknown. Exactly, you know? And I think that it is an issue that is useful, I think, for taking, you know, either depoliticized, apolitical, or like, you know, casually like conservative people and radicalizing them towards more reactionary positions, right? Like it's a sort of gateway reactionary drug, so to speak.
For sure. Kind of to shift gears, I guess. You recently did a couple episodes with The Future is a Mixtape.
Yeah, I love those fellas.
And on anti-utopianism. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. Yeah, it's a weird one. That's basically what the focus of my dissertation is on anti-utopianism, looking at literature and media as not. We have this hyper focus in our kind of media landscape on post-apocalyptic narratives or apocalyptic narratives in general. And I think that is really often steeped in like these misunderstandings of how human beings like act in crisis, right. And these sort of dystopian fantasies and fixations that end up empowering a very certain set of people, right? Empowering capitalists, making us afraid of anything that might shift the boat, right? And it's like, it's sort of cool thing to not have any hope, right? To be like, you know, like everything's doomed and I'm okay with that. And like, that is poison. Like that's fucking poison. Like, you know, it's okay to like look at the world soberly and recognize that like, you know, shit's going to hell in a handbasket. It's another thing to say, well, we're all fucked. So, you know,
I'm going to do whatever I want.
Exactly. It leads to sort of fatalistic nihilism that is entirely unproductive. And like, I know that like there's like like certain forms of like left nihilism and like insurrectionary anarchism can draw on that, and post-left, you know, the post-left writing draws on that too. But I think that stuff's interesting and often really poetic, but I also think it's a dead end. Yeah.
Like I find myself like I'm Gen X. I grew up in the sarcasm and doom and gloom age.
Right.
So I find myself often drawn to like that feeling that everything is doomed and there's nothing we can do about it. But also,
and it's a pervasive feeling. Everyone feels that way right now.
Right.
Like, everyone.
But I never feel like that's okay. Right.
Right.
Like, yes, I feel like we're doomed and there's nothing I can do about it, but I want to change that there's nothing I can do about it.
Right. And everyone seems to think that somehow you're enlightened, right? Like, I've accepted that we're fucked. And it's like, okay, no, you're just being a fatalistic, like, asshole. Like, you're not actually enlightened in some, you know, like, and I've had this conversation with people who I really admire who, like, are interested in, like, entropy or interested in post-humanism.
Right.
And are also interested in left politics, because I think there are nuances to that conversation. You know, we're all doomed. We're all going to die. Everything is fucked. But there's also that crucial invective of but right, exactly. And that's the part I think that anti-utopia is all about, is the but. Yes, things are fucked. How do we make it better? Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Like, society is degenerating in an incredibly rapid pace. Yes, things are not ideal at the moment by any stretch of the imagination. But we have to counteract the idea that any type of hope is childish, and we also have to fight for actual material changes to the world. And I think that one of the things that we can do to find examples of that is to look to fiction, to look to popular media that's doing that effectively, that's conjuring those alternatives to capitalist realism, to use the words of Mark Fisher, and to offer us hopefully something that is more nuanced, but also more hopeful. That isn't. That's what I just keep coming back to, is that it's not mired in this like we're fucked sort of thing.
Yeah, like I guess I keep trying to reach like the idea of, okay, so how do we create a utopia? So I'm just, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a hard question. I don't think that the goal of creating a utopia is one that we should engage in without serious consideration for its implications, because I think every ideological position, whether it's fascism or capitalism or anarchism, has a utopian moment, right?
Right.
For the capitalists, it's the sort of free market, right? For fascists, it's the ethno-state. For anarchists, it is an egalitarian society without states, where everybody is able to participate in freely and meaningfully in all of the decisions that impact their lives, right? Like, that's like in a nutshell what an anarchist
I guess you can tell which way I lean by which one of those sounded true to me.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. But like at the same time, people have had high-minded goals, and have aspired towards creating utopias and have done horrific shit to try and accomplish that goal.
For sure.
And so I think that any meaningful and thoughtful engagement with the project of utopia must be done with a incredibly critical and self-reflective mindset.
5-ish minutes. We can jump into Couterpropaganda if you want.
Yeah, let's do it.
So under Couterpropaganda, you say Biden's new anti-terrorism legislation.
Yeah, it's a doozy. I think this segment on your show. Do you want to explain it for Coffee with Comrades listeners who might be listening to this and might not know exactly what it is?
So Couterpropaganda is, I guess, we take something that is perpetuating wrong information, or it's kind of a myth, or I mean, it can come in various forms, I guess, so that we have to debunk or we have to argue against the current narrative or the mainstream narrative.
Which is something that you constantly have to do as a leftist. Like, literally, that is like a thing, which is one of the reasons why I appreciate that about your show, that you have a dedicated like segment that does that, because it's something you literally have to do all the time. Like, again, as an aside, I was just having a conversation with a dear friend and comrade of mine who was talking about police abolition, and she had to start from square one. And she was like, dude, like, I thought these were people who I really respect, who like, who know, are not like, unaware socially, but who I had to start with square one about like why the cops are bad, right? Like, she didn't even have to like she was like, yeah, I'm an abolitionist, and then they were like, what does that mean? So she literally had to start from the cops are bad, right? And like that's the case when you are a leftist. So I regardless, I really appreciate this segment. Anyways, so the counterterrorism bill that the Biden has introduced into legislation.
Yeah.
Is a doozy, and it's a doozy for many reasons. But I think the most interesting part about it, the thing that I find most remarkable, is that it lists off a number of different not organizations, but political ideologies, right? That they see as extreme, that they see as a threat, and it's very telling. Sorry, that's my dog. It's very telling because there are no statists on there. Right. It's all right. Anti-status. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to emphasize, is because and this is something I think it got lost in some of the discourse surrounding this Biden's anti-terrorist legislation, because or policy. I'm not sure if it's legislation, but it's definitely a policy, right? It's a policy position, right? And I think that this was something that was really lost in the discourse, was they're like, because I saw a lot of leftists be like, well, they're just using the term anarchists because they don't really care what you believe in, right? Like they're going to use anarchists to lump in communists, to lump in socialists. They're just yes, and that is true. That is absolutely true. But rhetoric is important. There's a reason why it's anarchists. Yeah. And it's because they are a threat to the state, right? And this is a state document. And so the reason why this is happening is, and the reason why anarchists are specifically labeled, is because the state recognizes, independent of Biden, as the state as an operating system, right? As a matrix of organizing the world and organizing power in our society, recognizes correctly that anarchists are a threat to it, right? Just in the same way that they recognize that reactionary militias are a threat to the state, and just in the same way that they recognize that Nazis are a threat to the state, right? Yeah. They recognize that they are a threat to the state because they threaten a monumental shift in the way that the state currently functions, right? The function of the modern neoliberal state, right? And I think that it's also important that they had anti-racist organizers on there. They called them like black identity extremists, right? Or they actually might have called them. That's what Obama called them. They actually might have called them. I think in order to like erase the different, again, because it's all about erasure, right? Erasing the differences between black liberationists and white nationalists, right? I think they just called them all like ethnic related extremists or something like that.
Yeah, of course.
But that's to erase, right, the fact that like a white ethno state threatens the current modern neoliberal state just as much as black liberation, right? And the fight against white supremacy threatens the state. And it lists environmental activists, just like that young lady who was just sentenced to 8 years in prison for fighting against the Line 3 pipeline, right? Because it is a threat to the function of capital, right? And capital and the state go independently. And so I think it's telling that state communism and socialism is not listed as an extremist position, because those aren't necessarily threats to the way that the state currently functions, right? And that's because of the fact that a lot of people who call themselves communists in the world today, such as Communist China, are perfectly happy and willing to work with the capitalist machinery, right? Yeah. Doesn't matter how many bodies are sacrificed onto the gears, they will call themselves communists, but that's not a threat to the current modern neoliberal state, because it's not actually signifying a meaningful change in the way that the state is able to function. The same was true historically, right, with the USSR, which transitioned and became they called it state capitalism. Again, perfectly able to function within a capitalist worldview, right? They were incredibly competitive with the United States empire, and even though they were, eventually, I don't want to use the term vanquished because that gives way too much credit to the U.S. But even though the USSR ultimately was a failed state, it was a failed state project, it was a competitor, but it wasn't a threat to the state as such. And so anyways, I think that is an important thing. And I think that is an important analysis that ought to be foregrounded, that the correct and factual observation that the people in power erase the differences and the nuances between anarchists and communists and socialists. Even though that's true, I don't think that particular observation erases the fact that it's only anti-statists or I mean, not only anti-statists, but it's only people who threaten the current functioning of the state, right? That's probably the better way to word it. It's only people who threaten the current functioning of the state that are listed as extremists. And they make this very clear. I know I'm talking a lot here, but I think it's really, really important because they make this explicitly clear because they say anyone that like threatens the ubiquity of capital, who thinks that the current ethnic makeup of the United States is somehow devious or imperfect, right? Anyone who thinks that our ecological systems are unsustainable and is willing to take direct action to combat them, those people are listed as extremists, right? And the last point that I want to make here is that is an incredibly backwards position to think about, because the people who are, which is to say that like Nazis and white supremacists aren't extremists, they are, but it is the height of folly to insist that keeping capital, the gears of capital and the state running on as normal is not an extremist position, because look at where we are in the world. We are, just less than a decade away from reaching an increase in 2 degrees centigrade, which would absolutely make vast swaths of this planet uninhabitable by human beings, right? We are seeing ecological collapse. We are seeing refugees being flung throughout all of the world. We are seeing a rise in reactionary far-right politics. All of this stems from two things, Corey, two things: capitalism and the state, right? Which are in many ways inseparable, right? And to say that we can just continue this quest for infinite profit on a finite planet, that is an extremist position.
Sold. You got me. Yeah, no, it's, I think the thing that I always get hung up on is the idea of like labeling various groups as domestic terrorists implies that they're dangerous in some way to like the members of the society, right?
Right.
And okay, so white supremacists, Nazis, these extremist people that want an ethno-state, like they murder people in the street.
And they're proud about it. They brag about it.
That's
like
right.
They go in front of like microphones, and journalists stick microphones in their face and they're like, yeah, I beat the shit out of that person. Like they're proud of it. Yeah,
and anarchists aren't out there murdering people in the street. Like it's not a thing that's being done by the other groups. Like Black Lives Matter, fighting for racial justice, fighting against the police. That's not an extremist position. It's not a terrorist position because they're not committing terrorism. They're not harming people. They're not killing people.
And that's part of the reason, like, why terrorism, especially post 9/11, has become such a malleable term, right?
Yeah.
And it's a term that I see a lot of good-natured people who have good politics using the term terrorism to point to people like Dylan Roof, right? Or to point to the New Zealand shooter whose name currently escapes me. May he rest in piss, right? These, but people try to say, people who have progressive or leftist politics will say, right, that's terrorism, right? But the entire term of terrorism has been so divorced from its actual concrete meaning to become essentially meaningless, right? Yeah. It is now a rhetorical cudgel wielded by those in power to name and to suppress its dissidents, right?
Yep.
And you bring up an interesting and I think an important point, right? That like people fighting for Black liberation, people fighting against pipelines, people fighting for a stateless society are not terrorists, right? They're not like in the dictionary definition, they are not using fear in order to achieve their political goals, right? That is like the dictionary definition definition, right, in so many words of terrorism is to use fear in order to achieve your political goals.
Yeah.
Anarchists have done that in the past, and that is a part of anarchist history, and it shouldn't be erased. But we're not doing that anymore because we realize that it's not effective. It's not an effective way of galvanizing people to your position. It's not useful, right? Yes, that has been a historical part of anarchism. Yes, it should be one that is talked about soberly and critically, but it's not where we're at now. It's just not, and I think that the entire the point that I guess I'm trying to make, and I'm probably belaboring it, is that the term terrorism is essentially meaningless. It means nothing. Broken. It is a rhetorical cudgel.
Yeah, it's a broken word.
Which pisses me off because I'm an English professor. I love words. I fucking love words. So it pisses me off that that's the case, but that is the case. Yeah,
it's frustrating. I mean, the list of broken words at this point is so long.
Yeah, we live in it is a point that is so patently obvious that it probably doesn't bear repeating, but we are definitely in the throes of a post-truth society at this point.
Yeah, that's right. I think your point that the state is specifically targeting groups that it sees as a threat to its power. I think that's a pretty important point that needs to be emphasized, because the reason that the state often cracks down on like the insurgents from January 6th or like the white supremacist movements is because they create instability, which capitalism hates, right?
Even though capitalism itself creates instability constantly. Like it literally has to create instability. And it has, like, as Richard Wolff and many other economic scholars have pointed out many times, like it intentionally creates instability and crisis because it thrives in crisis. Anyways, I digress.
No, but absolutely. That's, I think, and maybe my history is a little bit off, but ultimately, I think that's why, like, states like the U.S. entered into World War II, because it ultimately became an unstable for capital at one point, and they had to fix that. They didn't care about the Jewish people. They didn't care about the countries that had been overrun by the Nazis. They cared about the instability for capital.
Precisely. Yeah, and as the maxim goes by Lenin, right? Like, capitalism is fascism in decay. Or rather, I got that. I inversed it. Fascism is capitalism in decay, right? And so it behooves, right? It behooves capitalists who are interested in protecting their power to protect the state, right? And to protect it from seizure by fascists. And so I think that, the point is incredibly demonstrative of the ways in which capitalism, as it currently exists, is entirely inseparable from the functioning of state power. And I would also go so far as to argue that has always been the case, but the difference now is that it is a ubiquitous thing, right? It's not just something that happened in certain places across the world. Now it is literally a ubiquitous world system, which is fucking horrifying.
Yeah, which makes it, I guess, even more of an uphill battle to deal with. But we're not doing doomer here.
Nope. Not today, at least. There's a time and a place for that, but not today.
All right. So, foes and comrades. You've got mutual aid disaster relief, or the SRA for comrades.
Yes, absolutely. Mutual aid disaster relief and SRA are both engaged in really meaningful disaster relief organizing right now. I have good friends and comrades who are in the region in the southeast right now, and I'm in a handful of different signal chats at the moment that are currently popping off with people talking about and organizing different disaster relief for the different hurricanes that are currently assailing the southeast region of the United States, or are gearing up to do so. And so, obviously, it goes without saying that the people who are engaged in that work are fucking heroes and doing beautiful and meaningful and necessary work. And even if they are not like names recorded in history books, they're people who are making a significant and immeasurable difference in the lives of people in those areas who are impacted by these disasters. So shout out to both of those beautiful organizations.
Awesome. Where can people find your content?
Yeah, so if you fuck with Coffee with Comrades, you can find us pretty much anywhere on any podcasting platform. That's sort of how podcasts work at this point. You upload it one place and it's everywhere. So whatever app you fancy, you can find Coffee with Comrades there. You can find us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades. You can find us on Instagram at Coffee with Comrades. We also have a Patreon if you are into supporting independent left DIY media. That's patreon.com/Coffee with Comrades. I'm on Twitter as well, just my name, Pearson Bolt. You can follow me there if that's your jam. I mostly just talk about music and politics. So if those things interest you, then fuck yeah.
Sounds good.
And if you like poetry, you can go to rebelheartspublishing.com. My book, Like Watching God Become Human, is available there. Although the first edition is almost sold out. So if that's something that you're interested in,
cool.
You can check it out there.
I recently just interviewed a young guy who started a anarchist literary magazine titled Rulerless. So
that's fucking sick. I love it.
Yeah. He's 17-year-old guy starts his own magazine. Beautiful.
You love to see it.
Yeah.
I love what happens when creative leftists get ideas. It's beautiful.
For sure.
Well, this has been great, Corey. I really appreciate you inviting me on and letting me yak. It's always cool hooking up with folks who are doing left media and chatting with them and, floating around in these different circles. So I appreciate your time and thanks for having me on.
You bet. I'm glad we could connect.
Yeah, for sure. Me too.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I enjoyed doing it. You can find all the links for Pearson's content and links for his comrades in the show notes. Now on to Ask an Anarchist.
Well, I did have a thought.
Okay,
with the no authority, this is a really weird one, but I was listening to Jim Jeffries, and there were manatees, and one of the things that it's a weird connection. But anyway, one of the guys he was talking to, explaining, like in Florida, they have certain zones where the boats have to slow down because all the manatees like to go in shallow water. Next in Florida like to rip around really fast, and if they hit the manatees, it's all bad. Now, if there's no authority, which is kind of what you're saying, how in an anarchist society do you crack down on that kind of stuff? Because if it's a mutual thing, and these rednecks are like, no, I want my boat as fast as humanly possible, and screw the manatees,
Yeah, no, that's a good question because ultimately, like, most anarchists are thinking big picture, right? We're trying to lay out a structure of society that could work on a horizontal fashion where perhaps in a situation like that, your community would come up with a rule. Well, okay, in general, we all agree we're not gonna speed through this area because we don't want to kill the manatees, and manatees are part of nature, and we all, care about that. And then you get one guy who just doesn't give a shit and does whatever he wants. And so then you have to appeal. Then you have the community has to come up with a way to deal with that in the moment, so that, they can all say, we agree that this person shouldn't be part of our community right now because they can't abide by this particular rule and they can't respect the manatees. So then that person has to move on to another area where they don't get to be in a boat and and speed past the manatees, right? So, and I'm just rattling off the top of my head, but the core,
it was a weird example, but that's what I'm meaning is that
you
have to have rules. You have to have rules sometimes, and then that seems to me is it brings back banishment. You have been banished forthwith.
Yeah. Or, you could have, because there won't be, in an anarchist society, there's no such thing as like a private property, right? So the boat would be a community boat. We would all share it equally, and, we would use it when we needed to or when we wanted to have fun or whatever, right? So then your, your right to use the boat could be revoked for a time because of your mistreatment of the agreement that we all made when we bought, put this boat in the water. So,
it's one of those things where I think I get the theory. My brain goes to the practice and saying, I don't know if it would work. Because, people are assholes.
Okay, so I'm at about 3 minutes and 20 some seconds into my discussion with Renee. And essentially, the thing that I feel like I didn't say that I should have said is that ultimately I'm not the arbiter of the justice in this particular region in Florida, right? Like there will be a Florida commune who would have their horizontal structure of their community, and those people would assign perhaps a manatee protection officer or something along those lines. Not a cop, because like a conservation officer, like not a cop, but somebody who cares for the area, cares for the nature or what have you. Again, I'm just coming up with random ideas, and I've got 2 or 3 ideas that could be voted on through the horizontal community societal structure. There are rules in various ways, and those rules are not imposed by an authority, but are part of the way that we treat each other in a society. Like, there's a lot of unspoken rules that we follow in society already, and they don't need to be enshrined in law, and they don't need cops to uphold them. They're just rules that we follow. And yes, you get jerks who don't follow those rules, and then people in general have to deal with those people in some way or another. Like, if you say racist things, we don't talk to you, or we don't listen to you. We aren't going to pay attention to what you're saying because what you're saying is shitty. So if you are a person who can't follow the rules regarding the manatees, then that's something that, we as our group, if I happen to be in that group, then I would say, what are our options here? What are the things that are causing this to happen? Is it just a disregard for the rules? Is this person seeking some kind of attention for something? Because usually that kind of behavior is attention seeking. It's not just because they're a dick. It's because they've been entitled, or they've been, there's reasons that these things happen. And part of the re-education, the rethinking of society is to look at these situations and ask those questions. And then as a group, determine the best outcome or the best way to move forward that isn't a carceral punishment type of situation, because we don't want to rehash the way that things work now, but we do have to have certain rules, right? Yeah, I think I guess
part of it is
go ahead.
I'm too Hobbesian in my view. Without society, life would be brutish and short.
And I think that actually most anarchists would actually agree with that particular phrase. We would just think that the way we structure our society fundamentally changes the way that people behave. We currently have a system that doesn't care about people and treats most people like cogs in a machine that are both disposable and useless if they fall apart. Where if we structure our society in a more respectful way, where everybody has what they need without having to suffer through wage slavery to get it, then maybe people would make different choices. We wouldn't always be in competition with one another. And, we kind of hope that this would all lead to a better behavior. This isn't necessarily an answer to the question, what should you do if somebody breaks a rule? But it is an addressing of the overall situation, because the question is asked in a way that is based in this current system, right? So we have to reimagine the way that we're both going to teach people how to behave, the way that we're going to fulfill their needs, and the way that we're going to deal with them if they break the rules. Perhaps if, and again, I'm just coming up with these off the top of my head, perhaps if a person is, they really enjoy time on the water and they're just dicking around and they accidentally go into an area where they're not supposed to go, then we might have to, just remind them that they're not supposed to go into that area. But if they do it intentionally, then that's a different situation. And you have to examine these things and ask the question why, as well as try to determine the outcome that would be best suited for everyone and reduce the incidences of rule breaking. I mean, that you're still going to get your one-offs. You're still going to get your shitheads that like hurting people and like breaking the rules. And you are going to have to figure out ways to deal with that. but in general, it would be, the idea is to reduce those things by fulfilling everybody's, both material needs and psychological needs.
Like I said, it's one of those things where it's an interest theory. It just, my practical side goes, I don't know if that would actually work. Cynical.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And that's something that you're going to hear a lot from non-anarchists, is that I don't think that would work. I think it sounds great in theory, but I don't think it would work. And I think often it's rooted in a very this is the way society is now thinking. And I don't want to straw man Renee or other people who say this, but it's very typical to hear somebody say, I don't think that would work in practical ways. And then just because they personally don't agree with the ways that I happen to come up with solutions in the moment, right? And again, I don't want to straw man Renee. I don't want to attack Renee. This is a very standard way that people respond to these things. And I think that there's merit to the, I don't know if that would work question, but there's also merit to say our anarchist society is structured in a horizontal way in which, without a carceral justice system. So we have, say, a community that decides on what to do when somebody breaks a rule and whether or not that warrants some level of punishment or consequence or some other kind of support. And that's something that the community can come up with, and because we're looking at it in a different way, we're trying to reimagine society. It's not just, oh, well, I don't think that would work. That is the correct, I don't think that that's the correct way to respond to it. I think that ultimately we have to give some space for society to grow as we reach for these goals. And different anarchists are going to come up with different solutions to these problems. But it always has to be, in order to be an anarchist solution, it has to be the people of the community deciding what's best for the people of that community in a way that doesn't have one person deciding for everyone else.
A utopian ideal.
Well, I think that it is easy to dismiss it as utopian. But I also think that there are examples throughout history of when shit goes wrong, we have people band together and help one another. And it's often the case that it's people with more power than your average citizen that come along and they fuck it up. I don't know if you, I used the example when talking to Chris Watson a few months ago about Behind the Bastards, talked about a case in, I can't even remember the place where it was now, but I might have been San Francisco. There was a giant fire and it like destroyed like a massive amount of the city. And you had citizens who had lost their homes going from business to business and building to building, gathering what they could. And then all of the citizens were sharing that amongst themselves until the powers that be, the military, came into play. And then they started telling people what they couldn't do. And they started arresting people for sharing food and stuff like this, where for a while they had this fully functioning little community helping each other and running just fine until authority came in. And you can find pockets of this throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, mind you can also find it where that's also called power vacuum, where then someone that
actually, I think I mischaracterized that. It wasn't just that the military came in; it was like some landowner, some person who owned property within the city limits, didn't like that people were stealing, quote unquote, stealing. And you saw that with Hurricane Katrina and stuff like that, where people were calling it looting when nobody's there. Like, this stuff is either going to go to waste or it's going to be, if they don't take it, then it's wasted. If people don't take stuff that, like food that's on the shelf in a store that's going to be flooded, then it's wasted food. But they called it looting and they called it stealing when it's not. It's just using the resources you have available to survive. And it's people with property or people with power who can then come in and say, hey, send in the military, send in the police. These people are criminals. These people are breaking the law.
Someone that's opportunistic steps in and
yes, which is often a person that
shits over everything.
Yeah, they often already have like a level of power in one way or another, so they're used to being able to tell people what to do, or they own property, so they don't want people touching their property, stuff like that. I'm not an expert in it, but there's a great podcast called Women's War. The thing that I mistakenly did here was I tried to argue that there was a power vacuum and that we could deal with that. Where once you actually reach a level of society where you have an anarchist society where things are set up in a horizontal fashion, there's no power vacuum, because every week or so you elect a new representative who can then make certain decisions, and then all of society is voting on other decisions. There's no power vacuum because the power is within the hands of the people. So this power vacuum thing, it's a thing that happens in many cases now because of the hierarchical structure of the situation. And I think part of what I say here to Renee addresses that, but part of it doesn't. By Robert Evans, who talking about Rojava, where they basically, their society was in kind of a collapse, right? Like, they're in the middle of this ISIS and America war, and there's all these other people trying to kill them. Their government is trying to kill them. And so they kind of created an autonomous zone where they run things themselves and hold off offending armies with like volunteer armies sort of thing. And it's not a perfect example, but it's essentially in a city or a community without a particular leader, without one person who's in charge, and various people take various duties at different times so that no one person is staying in a position of power over others. So, and it's mostly run by women doing this, which adds to the anarcha-feminist view of it. So I really recommend the podcast. It's really interesting, but this is something that was brought up in the Monty Python skit. Nobody stays in power in a situation like that. You routinely have somebody who's making decisions on a day-to-day basis, but you never have somebody who stays there and that's their job forever, or for 4 years or whatever. And then the job is to attain that again. Somebody is placed there by the people, and then their turn is done and somebody else comes in. And then their turn is done and then somebody else comes in. And it's never a person who continually is always doing the job. And the goal is never power. The goal is to make the right decisions for the community. So where are we in?
I think it's like the defining of anarchy. I'm not sure. Now we got lost into the specific examples, which we could probably argue all day about, Well,
and that's
because under pressure, people can react differently to different situations, and I think I'm a big history buff, so going into history is a good thing. But
I think that that's always going to happen. You're never going to be able to discuss whether or not anarchy can work in society, in a real world setting, without discussing real world examples of where it might fail and where it might work. And the goal of anarchy is a society where the power belongs within the hands of the people and nobody rules over anybody. So it has to be able to roll with the punches, right? Like it has to be able to adapt and be pragmatic and evidence-based. And materialistic, materialist, not materialistic, but materialist. So in that sense, we could argue about individual examples all day long, but we always always have to discuss various theoretical things as well as various real world situations. I think an anarchist, I think we might say that in most cases, the reason that people react in various ways is because of various pressures, right? Like the reason you get a dictator, or the reason you get ISIS out of the war in Iraq is because you have various other pressures forcing, pushing things in one way or another. And it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort to deal with all these various pressures. And anarchists are viewed as utopian because we do try to look at the long-term project as creating the best possible world, right? Despite various examples.
Yeah, I mean, that's I look at ISIS, and we'll use that as an example, that's more of it came out of a power vacuum.
Right.
Right. Because a lot of people that were from ISIS were from, if I remember right, and I could be wrong, is that a lot of them came from the army. And when the Americans disbanded them, just up and went, you're done. And that's kind of where they drew all their people that became ISIS, much in the same way as you're having that problem in Afghanistan now, is that the resurging of the Taliban because they're creating a power vacuum. Because the Americans are drawing down without a stable society. But
yes, and I don't think I said this at the time, but these things, like this was still a region under attack by American forces or by other forces and by religious extremists. And there's other things at play here that wasn't just it's not just a power vacuum, but a power vacuum with other forces pushing people in various directions and pushing people into ISIS and pushing people into the Taliban. Yeah, which is where you can't create an anarchist or even a socialist or communist society by just murdering the people who are currently leading the society we're in, right? Like people talk about a revolution, and you can't just create a revolution by guillotining everybody, no matter how much I like the jokes. You can't do it because a revolution has to be an educational revolution, right? Otherwise, bad people will just step in place. Right?
Well, I mean, if we go back to that as an example, right? The aristocrats, which they were assholes, and then you had, I can't remember how many, but you had the time of terror where they were just chopping everybody's heads off. Yeah, they had exactly 5 different types of governments that all collapsed until finally Napoleon came in. So you got rid of a king and got an emperor. So I'm not sure if they're that much further ahead.
No, ultimately it just ended up with a bunch of people dead. And I mean, there were some some people have gone into it, and there's, benefits to various times during that, and negatives to other times. And there was some good philosophy that came out of it, but ultimately, like, you still ended up with modern France, which is still a capitalist country, and colonizer, just like every other capitalist European country colonizer. So,
well, it was kind of the thing to do. It was,
yeah.
European countries were doing it.
Yeah, it was like almost viewed as a survival tactic in a way, right? Because if every country around you is colonizing and running their society in this way, what do? You do the same thing. You try to amass as much fortune and fame and land as you can. Yeah. But again, an anarchist would argue that's not actually for the best of everybody in humanity. Yes, I would argue that's not for the best of everybody in humanity. I think that the best for everybody in humanity is a society where the people have the power. And there are ways one can look at this. The Project of America had inklings of the power to the people type mentality. Various other movements throughout history have had inklings of this power to the people type mentality. And that's, I think, the ultimate takeaway is that anarchism is supposed to be about people having power and making decisions for their community, and not some ruler from afar, like a president or even a governor or a prime minister or a premier or whatever. No kings, no queens. That's my point, is that however you decide, however we happen to end up building this society, I don't get to dictate it. And I may not have the answers to every single question. I can try to answer many of them, and address many of the various criticisms. But ultimately, the power will rest in the hands of the citizens of the society, and they will be the ones that make these decisions. All right, so I hope that helps clear up a little bit about anarchism. Now I'm going to send you over to Red Reviews. All right, we are now live. Hi and welcome to Red Reviews number 8 with Justin Clark. So I guess, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Well,
awesome.
I've got a bit of a cold, but
right on. Yeah, it's been very humid and rainy here in Indiana, so we've had to deal with a lot of that. And
yeah, we have up north. There's like a forest fire. So the smoke is creating a haze everywhere, and like,
oh yeah,
my allergies have been going wild, and yeah,
that's probably what you're alongside what you might be dealing with. That's rough.
Yeah,
yeah, it's tough. Yeah, because it's almost like sometimes I like we're not having to really wear masks as much anymore, but there's a part of me that's like, well, maybe we should bring them back. I know I'm wearing my mask once winter hits.
Oh yeah,
because I didn't get a cold or I didn't get anything last year because I had my mask on all the time. So I'm definitely doing that once the fall hits.
Yeah, in Saskatchewan, on July 11th they removed all restrictions.
Yeah, that was here in Indiana. They did it far earlier, so they did it June. I think it was June 6th is when they did it. So. And I'm back full time in the office now. I don't remote work anymore. They pretty much just cut it off. They're like, you're not doing any remote work anymore. So it is what it is.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can maybe develop some kind of policy later on, but it is what it is. It's the joys of being a public employee that doesn't get to belong to a union. So
right. Jeez, eh?
But anyway, yeah, I think that actually is a really good segue into the book we're talking about tonight. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism by Richard Wolff.
Cool.
I think it was published in 2012 by Haymarket Books. Great left independent book publishing company out of the States. And this book is the go-to guide about worker co-ops or worker cooperatives. What he calls in the book workers' self-directed enterprises, or WSDEs.
Right.
That's what he calls them in the book. Okay. And what it is this book is, I think, even more prescient than ever because I think it really gets into a lot of the deep structural problems within capitalism itself. One of the things I think that's really important for people to understand is what makes capitalism capitalism. So he does a really good job of explaining that. So like just as a theoretical marker, like, okay, well, what is capitalism? So a lot of people would say, oh, well, it's markets. That's actually not, right? So there's market socialism, right? There's markets existed in pre-capitalist societies, whether that be in sort of feudal Europe or even earlier, or bartering or exchange has been around almost as long as humans have. So markets themselves are not necessarily capitalistic. What makes capitalism capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production. That's what makes capitalism capitalism. And so he talks about, and he delineates it and explicitly calls it private capitalism because he compares it to state capitalism, which is the kind of economic model that existed in sort of real actually existing socialist states like the former Soviet Union or today the People's Republic of China, Cuba, Vietnam, to a greater or lesser extent, North Korea. So those have state capitalist models. They're not technically socialism yet, but they're close, or depending on how you look at it. But yeah, depending on how you look at it. But so private capitalism, the way that private capitalism is set up, imagine a business that someone owns. The employees are contracted out by the employer. The employer keeps the surplus value. Right. Which is, he keeps the profits, right? Well, why does he keep the profits? It's all in the way that the system is organized, right? So it's, if you have a situation where business is owned by one guy and he owns it, meaning he owns the capital, he owns the building, or he rents the building out, or he owns the capital stock, then he or she gets to benefit from the profits of what the workers produce. The workers don't have a say in any of that, generally. And this is one of the huge problems of capitalism. It lends itself to volatility. This is something we talked about earlier when we discussed Engels, where we talked about how there's the socialization and planning that goes on within firms, and then there's the chaos that exists outside of firms. Right. The market. And the market, right? And production and distribution are often at odds with one another. But the one thing that Richard Wolff really harks on, and Richard Wolff, for those who don't know, he is a Marxist economist. I think he taught at the University of Massachusetts. And he actually set up his own organization called Democracy at Work. That is they're basically like a content creation company that does multiple different podcasts. So he does his Economic Update once a week as a podcast. They have a podcast called All Things Co-op, which is all just about different co-ops and people doing specific things relating to co-ops and sort of those kinds of stories. I think there's Capitalism Hits Home, which is all about the relationship between capitalism and the family and sort of workers, gender issues, reproductive rights, that kind of stuff. So they do a bunch of different podcasts. So if you've listened to Richard Wolff for a lot for a lot of years, or you've listened to him a lot, you've kind of got the gist of what this book is. This book is a really great distillation, an overview of a lot of his broader concepts. So it, it goes into, the crises of capitalism. So the book was published in 2012. So the big crisis of capitalism that he wrote about at the time was the crisis of 2007, 2008. Right. Obviously now we're living through the wreckage of another economic crisis due to COVID. Yeah. And he's actually written a new book called The Sickness is the System, which is kind of a sequel to this, where he talks about the problems of coronavirus in relationship to capitalism. Cool. And maybe we'll cover that at a future time or whatever. But yeah, so because capitalism is set up with private ownership, and specifically the thing that he likes to really point out that's super important is that production and distribution are really important, and we shouldn't discount those as understanding different economic models. But the other part of it that he thinks is super important is who gets to keep the surplus and why.
Right, right.
That's a really important part, right? So in private capitalism, the capitalism that we live under in the United States or Canada, even the most broad-based social democracies like Scandinavia, they are still private capitalist societies, is that a private firm gets to keep the surplus value of that firm. We discussed earlier, they get to keep the profits. Workers don't have any say in what those do and where those go, rather. Now, there are some arrangements that are not technically worker cooperatives where there are some inroads on this. So like in Germany, for example, there's, I think it's a particular piece of legislation or policy wherein certain amounts of a board of directors of a major corporation have to be employees.
Okay.
Which is something that when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were running in 2020, they both advocated for, was workers on boards. Okay. Which is, I guess, better than nothing, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the problem, which is that if you have somebody who's a majority shareholder in a public company, say like, Amazon is a good example, right? So like, even if you had workers on the board of directors of Amazon, Jeff Bezos still owns the majority of the shares.
Yeah. How important are their votes, right?
Yeah. Their votes don't really matter all that much in relationship to everything else, right? Because they don't own like a managing stake.
Yeah.
So it would be better and it would help maybe alleviate some worker concerns, but overall it generally doesn't. And so one of the key tenets of Marxist theory is the idea of the decline of profit over time. So capitalist firms, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, tend to just make less and less profits. And there's reasons for that. So it's like if you have to increase wages or you have to increase production costs, all of those things, right? So sometimes, it's like if you go into a fast food restaurant and you're like, wow, that meal I got seemed a little bit more expensive. The reason it's more expensive is because their ability to obtain a profit commensurate with what they want is not available under the current circumstances, right? They have to pay their employees maybe a little better, or their, the capital stock is a little bit more expensive. Like say, for example, right now in the United States, one weird side fact I learned listening to a podcast recently was that there's a national chicken wing shortage.
Oh, is that right?
So like chicken wings are almost like really hard. They're really hard to get, so they're more expensive.
Okay.
Some foodstuffs are just going to be more expensive because it's a little bit harder to get them produced under the pandemic conditions.
Right. Global supply. Fruit that's out of season or what have you.
Yeah, fruit that's out of season, meat, certain types of vegetables, like all of those are going to be, they're seasonal. Like those tend to get more expensive. And the reason they get more expensive is because the capitalists who own those firms need to be able to turn a profit that works within the particular mode of production that we're in, which is private capitalism, right? So if profit is declining more and more over time, well, then how do you make up for that? Well, the way you do that is by squeezing workers, right? So like, we know firms that have like absolutely devastated, workers' ability to have any kind of real rights or any kind of redress of grievances within the system itself. So like Amazon's a great example of this, right? The day that we're taping is the day that Jeff Bezos went into his giant dick-shaped ship in the sky.
Yeah.
It's hilarious that it was shaped like a giant dick, which it's like poetry, but and he literally said today in the press conference, he said, I want to thank Amazon employees and customers. And he didn't say like, because of your support, we've been able to achieve these things, like put it in lofty rhetoric. Like he just fully dropped the fucking act and he literally said it, which is, he said, thank you for paying for this.
Right.
I mean, he just flat out said it. So it's like, I couldn't have thought of a better real world example of what I'm talking about.
No kidding.
And so because of those problems, because of the problems inherent to capitalism itself, the contradictions between production and distribution, the hoarding of the surplus by those who own it, the lack of real accountability or democracy within firms. I mean, essentially, if you work for a private company, you work for a private dictatorship. I mean, it's essentially a mini dictatorship in which you don't really have any rights. In the United States, there's something called at-will employment, which is that pretty much you can be fired for any reason and have no recourse against, your employer. Generally, the only thing you can really have recourse for if you're not in a union. If you're in a union, it's a different situation. But if you're not in a union, you get fired. Really, the only way you could ever maybe account for that is if they fired you because you were an African American, or you were a woman, or you were a transgender person, or you were gay. Like, that's when you can make an argument under the Civil Rights Act, like, hey, I was fired because I was gay, or hey, I was fired because I'm trans.
Right.
Like that, but that's it. Otherwise, they can just kick you out the door. And they may already fire you for that, but then they use some other excuse on paper to get rid of you.
They just have to make up like some reason other than that.
Yeah, they can come up with some bullshit like insubordination, right?
Yeah.
So because of these problems, we've seen, he spends a lot of the book, probably the first third of the book, talking about the crisis of 2007, 2008. So for those that don't really know about that, maybe you're a little younger or you need to pay attention at the time, I'll try to give you a quick overview of what that was. So back in the mid to late 2000s, there was a real estate bubble, a massive, massive real estate bubble here in the United States. And when this housing boom was going on, a lot of these loans were basically crappy loans that people were getting.
Yeah.
And they were called ninja loans, which is like no income, no job, no assets. That's what they called them, ninja loans. And they were also called subprime mortgages. This is something you probably have heard in the news or reading something, right? And what that means is that these are loans that are heavily leveraged, meaning like, especially if you don't have an income, you don't have a job, you don't have any assets, and you might buy a $250,000 home, but you don't have any income coming in, right? Now, why was this a problem? Well, the reason this was a problem was, over the sort of 10, 15 years after the deregulation of the banking and financial sector in the 90s and early 2000s by Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, the financial firms were able to create these very intricate new financial instruments that could be traded on the market. One of them was called an MBS, or a mortgage-backed security. And what it was let's say you buy a house, your bank has your loan. In the old days, you would buy a home, and chances are you'd get the loan for your house from your local bank that you banked with. And your bank had your loan for the entirety of its loan. Okay? Yeah. That's how it used to be traditionally. But because of banking deregulation that happened in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s, that's not how it was. So what happened was that banks, you would get a loan, then your bank would sell that loan to another institution. And then what that institution would do is break up the value of your mortgage into what were called mortgage-backed securities that people could then buy on the market. And this was really hot at the time. And so what happened was over time, everything got completely over leveraged and it got overexposed. Right. More people bought homes than they could afford, but that was also based on policy that was directed explicitly by the Bush administration. That was like home ownership is like what we're trying to push for. And so there was a sort of a perfect storm of like people who didn't have the real income or assets to buy a home, mixed with deregulation that made it way easier for these toxic assets to exist. And then you had these other financial instruments that were based on these financial assets that were predicated on continuing your mortgage payments. Well, what happened was there was a sort of global economic slowdown that started around 2007. And when that happened, people lost some of their jobs and people were unable to pay for their mortgages. Right. And because they were unable to pay for their mortgages, they defaulted on they defaulted on their mortgage. And when they defaulted on their mortgage, all of these mortgage-backed securities and other financial assets got over leveraged and they were basically worthless. And all of these firms they basically owed a massive amount of debt that they could not pay, which led to massive, system-wide failures. So one of the major firms that failed during the 2007-2008 crisis was Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns fell It was sold for pennies on the dollar, I think, to either Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers was the other one that collapsed in the 2007-2008 crisis. AIG was another one that collapsed during that period. So you had all of these breakdowns.
Right.
So what did the federal government do here in the United States to remedy this crisis? Well, what they could have done, what they should have done, was nationalize the banks, fire the top leadership, if not throw them in jail, because what they were doing was some of it was actually criminal. And then what they should have done was made homeowners whole. So they should have developed some kind of program to keep people in their homes.
Right.
And they didn't do that. Instead, what they did was, instead of really nationalizing the banks, what they did was they bailed them out.
Yeah.
And that was what was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, which was this, $700-800 billion package that was passed at the very end of the Bush administration and administered under the early days of the Obama administration. One of the things that the Obama administration did do early on was they did develop, I think, either through the stimulus bill that was passed in 2009 or Dodd-Frank, which was the financial regulatory bill that passed in 2010, was they developed a sort of homeowner protection program. But the problem is it's a very perfect example of, shitty bourgeois neoliberal government where they develop what on paper looks pretty good. Like, we're going to develop this program to keep people in their houses. Like, that's great. Problem was they didn't really fund it. And it kind of collapsed under the weight of the need because they didn't really put the sort of the bureaucratic infrastructure in place to make that policy work, nor did they really fully fund it the way they should have. And so instead of bailing out the people and taking over the banks and holding them accountable, what happened was the complete opposite, where the banks were bailed out, the financial institutions were largely, and they were largely off the hook, and the American public were stuck holding the bag.
Right.
And why did this happen? It happened because there were private firms that were interested in profit, and there was a speculative bubble based on real estate. Mm-hmm. And it's not unlike the Great Depression. The Great Depression of 1929, the Great Crash of 1929 and led into the Great Depression of the 1930s was very much the same way. It was people making a bunch of speculative buys on the stock market, but they didn't actually have the capital to back up the purchasing of stock or the trading of stock. And when you don't have the money to pay for the losses that you've incurred doing trading, it's called a margin call, where people would buy stock what was called on margin. So you'd pay 10% of the value of the asset as collateral, right, and then you would pay it off with whatever gains you got. Well, the thing is when the stock market went through the floor in 2008, and then also went through the floor in 1929, the people didn't have the money. So everything went belly up. And
right.
And in some respects, and in many respects, the 1929 crash was much worse because the Federal Reserve didn't really respond to it in the way that the Federal Reserve responded to the crisis of 2007, 2008. So
lessons learned, I guess.
Lessons learned, right? So you have a massive economic crash in 2007, 2008. You have a massive recession that lasts for many, many years. And for some, the recession never really ended, which has led, I think, in the United States to continuing political crises and the election of Donald Trump. Yeah. I said for years that, the neoliberal order that existed in 2009, 2010, Obama and the European Union and all that, and the rest of it, they were able to sort of stabilize the system,
right,
as best as they could. And so the economic crisis that could have been much worse, and in many ways it still was terrible, but could have been much worse, they largely dealt with. And I said for years, even before I was, a Marxist or a socialist, I said for years, there's going to be an impending political crisis. The reason we didn't get the political crisis right away was because people were in sort of panic mode. And so they sort of trusted the elites to figure it out. Well, post, 2014, 15, the political crisis, in my opinion, started to begin. And that was, and some could say it started earlier with the Tea Party and shit. But
right, you could draw lines through whatever happened. But.
Yeah. But yeah, I think a lot of it is the result of sort of bad government policy, which is rooted around which is based around the fact that the economic model in the United States is private capitalism.
Yeah.
When you have private ownership, there's a certain level of chaos and inefficiency and contradiction.
Yeah.
So the way to remedy that crisis is through worker cooperatives. It's through worker self-directed enterprises, or WSDEs. What WSDEs do, what they are, is essentially a firm that is of, by, and for the workers. So instead of, a sort of board of directors and a CEO that sit up at the top and make a lot of money at the expense of everybody else, and the workers do all the work and they sit up top and keep all the money, that goes away. That's not to say that there aren't managers, because there are. So there are, but it's a much more horizontal model. So it's not completely without hierarchies, but the hierarchies are fully democratic in the sense that the workers choose the governing body of the organization that they work for.
Right. And so if they don't think somebody's doing a good job, then they can vote somebody else in or choose somebody else.
Exactly. They approve a manager's salaries. They approve the pay and compensation for people. So I think this would help solve the sort of CEO pay problem.
Right.
Because there are a lot of people who are high up CEOs who make crazy amount of money who are complete fucking failures.
Yeah.
I think of somebody like Carly Fiorina, who was the CEO of Hewlett Packard in I think the late 2000s or early 2010s. She ran that fucking company in the goddamn ground. And then she got to leave that company with a massive multi-million-dollar payout.
Right.
I think her name's Meg Whitman is another person like this, where, these people fail upwards. And the reason why they get to do that is because the way that private capitalism is set up is that the workers don't really have much of a say over who gets to be in what positions, what they get paid, and what they actually do. So worker co-op is set up differently, where, they choose the leadership, they choose the workers, and the leadership themselves are from the workers. So generally, and that's how unions used to actually be. So my mother-in-law worked for Chrysler. She worked for them for 4 decades. She was a member of the United Auto Workers, the UAW. And what she told me was when she started back in the late 1970s into the early 1980s, union stewards, or leaders within the UAW, they used to be people who worked on the floor. They were people who were actual workers who then became leaders within the union. Today, unions don't really work like that. Most of the leadership within unions in the United States, most of them are people who've never actually worked the actual job that they're in. Most of them are college educated. Most of them are completely divorced from most of the regular concerns of working people. The unions have really become sort of corporatized in the United States. I imagine Canada is probably similar.
It's very similar, yeah.
And, where essentially they're willing to sell out their workers for just a slightly better, possibly better arrangement.
Yeah.
But what worker cooperatives do is that you're not at the whim of the employer, because you are your own employer along with your colleagues. So that is a completely different model, and it solves a lot of problems that exist within private capitalism. But according to Wolff, it also solves a lot of problems with what's called state capitalism, or what we might call actually existing socialism. So if you think of socialist states, or broadly socialist states, like the former Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua under the Sandinistas.
Right.
So Burkina Faso, and state capitalism itself is a term that actually comes from Lenin. V.I. Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, the first head of the Soviet government, before his death in 1924, state capitalism was a term that he developed to sort of explain what they were doing. So, in Marxist theory, a socialist or even a communist society is built upon stages of development. And so with Russia, they were sort of a feudal peasant society. And so what Lenin said was it was sort of a step up to go into what was called a state capitalist model. And what's the difference between state capitalism and private capitalism? Private capitalism, the means of production are owned by private individuals.
Right.
In state capitalism, the means of production are owned by the state. Now, some of you might go, well, wait, isn't that socialism? In some respects, it is. I do think on some level, sometimes I do think public ownership is a form of socialism.
Right.
But again, what's Richard Wolff's main point is that what makes a really healthy, democratic, vibrant socialism is where does the surplus go and who has control of where that surplus goes.
Right, right.
So in private capitalism, that surplus is divided among the shareholders. It's divided up amongst the elite top of a company who then decides for them, and the workers don't. Yeah. In the Soviet Union or in other sort of state capitalist societies, the process is largely the same, but instead of it being sort of, a board of directors, it's like it's a ministry.
Right.
Right. It's ministry officials, it's government bureaucrats who sort of develop that, and policymakers. So the state directs where the surplus goes. And one of the criticisms of sort of state capitalism or the sort of Soviet model or the PRC model is that surplus is not truly developed and distributed democratically because it's this sort of top-down model.
It's still, okay, so in Saskatchewan, we have our crown corporations, which is a sort of state capitalism where the province owns Sask Energy, Sask Power, and basically all our utilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so their profit, it goes into the government coffers. It doesn't automatically get distributed to, say, the citizens or the workers of the company.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The United States is the same way. So a good example of that would be the United States would be some of the energy companies, but they're sort of, again, the problem with this sometimes, and he acknowledges these terms are kind of squishy because sometimes a firm can kind of be sort of private capitalist, sort of state capitalist, like utility companies are like this here in the States, so my electricity provider is AES, which it used to be called IPL. Indianapolis Public Light, and Indianapolis Power and Light, and it was bought up by a bigger company called AES. So they're like this sort of quasi-public, quasi-private institution that sort of exists, in Superman 2, it's like the Phantom Zone,
right?
So it's so those exist as well, and those did exist within actually existing socialist states like the Soviet Union. So the inefficiencies and the sort of deep contradictions that exist within private capitalism can also exist within state capitalism. This is something that we'll actually talk about more in depth when we cover Michael Parenti's book, Black Shirts and Reds. He devotes an entire chapter to the sort of economic conditions that led to the end of the Soviet Union and why. And he goes into a really good explanation of what were the sort of internal problems that existed within the Soviet system. Because there were some, for sure, deep ones. Right. And so WSDEs or worker co-ops resolve some of these issues again, because again, instead of the surplus being divided by government bureaucrats or by bureaucrats working within a private firm, it's divided by the workers. And so what Wolff essentially argues for in the book is a form of market socialism, where you would certainly have public ownership, you would certainly have public planning, but alongside state ownership and state planning, you would also have work cooperatives working within a market-based socialist system, which I think for transition's sake is good. I'm not against that. I think it kind of gives everybody the best of every system. So I think markets can be a very beneficial thing when regulated and when sort of curbed by the excesses of the issues within that system, at least as a transitory thing to getting to something else. And then I also do think state ownership and state planning has a place. So one of the things that I personally advocate for, and it's something he talks a little bit about in the book, is public banking, where banking would be controlled by the state. And then, of course, you would have sort of democratic checks and balances to those systems. Right. And they would be far more open and accountable and democratic as state institutions than they would be as private institutions, and they would work better. And I mean, if you want a real example of exactly what I'm describing, the People's Republic of China is a lot like this, where they do have public banking, and they have public finance so that it allows them to direct their resources more efficiently based on need. And so, criticisms of the PRC aside, and I'm happy to hear all those, but that's one thing I think they do right. And I think that's something we could do in the States. And in fact, we did do it in the United States. From the 19-teens up into the early to mid 1960s, the United States had public banking, and it was at the post office. It was postal banking, where you could go in, you could have a bank account, you could have a checking account, you could have a savings account, you could get your check cashed there. I mean, imagine if the United States moved to a public banking model with the post office. The benefits of that, would be incredible. First off, the post office wouldn't have the insolvency problems that it has. We can get into a whole other discussion about why those exist, because it's a deliberate result of public policy of right-wingers who, because the U.S. Postal Service is the only federal government agency that requires its pension plan be funded through the next 75 years. No other pension plan is required to do that. Yeah. So even though the post office is handling more money than ever and more demand than ever, and they make an incredible amount of money for the public, they're in the red, even though if you took away this stupid bureaucratic thing that was passed by shithead Republicans during the Bush 43 era, they would be in the black, but because of the way that that's set up. But anyway, if you went to a public banking, imagine the sort of shitty check cashing places would be gone overnight.
Right. Yeah.
So imagine if we had public banking where people get checking accounts, savings accounts, they could get quick loans, that would be set at government mandated interest rates that would not be exorbitant.
Yeah.
And I think that would be great. So there would be certain sectors of the economy that would definitely be state directed, but they would also be mixed with worker cooperatives and markets. And that's kind of the model that he advocates for, and it's one that I think is worthwhile to think about.
It's certainly worth the examination.
Yeah. And so, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, well, this all sounds great in theory, but how does this work in practice? Well, there are actually real worker cooperatives that do exist and that are very successful. I'll give you a couple examples. I'll give you a small one and a big one. One's in the United States, one's in Europe. The small one that I'll give you is from the United States. It's a little place out in Maryland called Red Emma's. Red Emma's is this cooperative. It's named after Emma Goldman, the anarchist thinker. And it is a bookshop and vegan restaurant. And it is a worker cooperative. The workers own the business. They decide how that business is run democratically. They set wages. They set policy. They set who's going to be in leadership and who's not. And it's an extremely successful business. And, up until the pandemic, it was really an incredible example of it. And they survived the pandemic, thank goodness. But it's one of thousands. There are literally thousands of worker cooperatives within the United States.
Right. Yeah. Some
of them are probably gone now due to the pandemic, but there have been thousands for years. And so there's the sort of the micro example. The sort of macro example, the big one that everybody talks about, is the Mondragon Corporation, which is out of Spain. Mondragon is a company that is a corporation that is essentially a federation of cooperatives that work together. I think it has 80,000 employees, and it's the most successful worker cooperative in the world. It's not like a socialist paradise, but it's certainly a working model of how you could do, worker cooperatives in real time. Mondragon Corporation does a variety of different products and services, because of the sort of federated model that it has. So I think some of it's insurance, some of it's actually consumer goods, some of it's maybe banking.
Okay.
But it's very successful, extremely successful, and it's based on that model. And I think that the highest CEO to work, or the sort of manager or CEO to worker ratio within the Mondragon Corporation is anywhere between 3 to 8 to 1, which is pretty good, and whereas in the United States, the average CEO to average worker, ratio is, I think, 300 to 1.
Right.
So again, it's not completely without hierarchy. It's not completely without any kind of like structure, but it's one that is extremely democratic. It's accountable, and it actually works. And I think that those are great examples. And so, this is the cure. He calls this, the subtitle of this book is A Cure for Capitalism. And I think that worker cooperatives are one part of the cure for capitalism. I don't think they're the thing. And I don't think they're the one thing. I think sometimes Wolff, oversells them as the one thing, but I don't think that, because I do believe in a socialist future, based on my own political orientation, that I do think that there is some state ownership and planning that has to happen. I don't see us handling the sort of larger crises, because one of the things that I think he sort of talks a little bit about in the book, but I would like to hear more on, is the relationship between worker co-ops and environmental issues. Because I don't think climate change is going to be solved merely by worker cooperatives. I just don't.
Yeah. No.
So, yeah.
It's like you have to separate. Well, I guess it depends on how the worker cooperatives would handle, like how these companies would handle climate change and environmental issues. But just on its face, the theory almost is separate, right?
Yeah. And he discusses it in the book. But again, I mean, my whole thing is that, like, there can be times where the interests of the workers' cooperative are going to be at odds with what is in the interest of the environment. So, like, even if you have a firm that is like perfectly democratic, they could all just collectively democratically decide together, we're just going to, put our waste into the river next to us.
Right.
And so the thing is that, like, worker co-ops, I think worker co-ops that exist in a vacuum with, if you were to sort of plop worker co-ops into the current model we have right now, it would be better, but it would not solve the problem. Right. I still think that there needs to be a major shift in how resources are allocated and distributed. Like, I don't see it without any kind of like large scale public planning. I don't see issues like climate change or inequality really being addressed solely by worker co-ops.
Right.
So yeah, I think, in my opinion, at least, I think that, and I think he sort of hints at this too, but like a worker cooperative economic model would have to be paired with an extremely generous, social democratic welfare state that would have to buffet it. Right. And he talks about that. Like, if, let's say, you lose your job at a co-op, then you would get you basically get the 80% of your wages through the government is sort of an interim into getting what you would have your next job. Okay. And then the other thing is that the United States should always, like in any society, should have an employer of last resort. So, like, let's say, you have somebody who can't get a job at any co-op, because there are some people who aren't going to be able to work in a co-op. Yeah. What do? Well, for them, I think having them, be, employees of the state would be another way of doing that. And so you would have, public works like you did during the New Deal in the 1930s. And which brings us to a really important point that I kind of glossed over when talking about the history of how we got to where we are, which is the New Deal in the United States. In the 1930s, this massive, reorganization of American life and American government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, in the 1930s. Well, why did that happen? It didn't happen merely because of his benevolence, although, I think the thing about Roosevelt that made him, I think, a very a good president, for as good as you can use that term, right? Is that he was not as ideologically rigid. He was willing to listen to others and sort of have people around him who were different. And in the 1930s was when the left in the United States was at its peak, was not at its peak, but at one of its peaks. So you had a very successful, viable socialist movement. You had a very successful, viable communist movement. And these movements pushed Franklin Roosevelt to do these things because essentially Roosevelt will tell you, if he was here and I could talk to him, like his whole thing with the New Deal was saving capitalism from itself. And he saved capitalism. And so, because otherwise there was going to be a revolution.
Right.
And there was going to be pitchforks and torches, and so Roosevelt had the foresight to understand that. The other thing is that, but he did have a very strong, viable left movement on the outside pushing him to be better.
Right.
Back in 2008, 2009, when Obama was elected, a lot of people said, well, he's going to be like FDR. He's going to be like the next FDR. And there was a lot of hope for that, and I think I bought into that hype a little bit. I remember when Time magazine ran a front cover of Obama where they had his face photoshopped onto Franklin Roosevelt's body, and he had like the little hat and the monocle on, the little Prince Nez glasses and the big cigarette thing sticking out of his mouth. But that didn't happen. No. And that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, right? And one of them was because the United States did not have a viable left movement that could force him to do it.
Yeah.
What actually happened was not a revolutionary movement, but a counter-revolutionary movement that happened during the Obama years with the Tea Party.
Yeah.
And all of that sort of anger and populist energy, which could have been harnessed for good and could have led to something like a New Deal, actually led to, austerity, more neoliberalism, and Donald Trump. So
Which, I mean, you could draw a number of conclusions as to where that sort of those pressures came from and why that Tea Party movement was the way it was. Like, there's been an ongoing propaganda war for a long time about, pushing people to the right and believing in like neoliberal austerity programs and shit like that.
Absolutely. And our book that we'll discuss next week, Nixonland, will go into a lot of the history of how that started and kind of the development of the modern American right and how we got to where we are. And the problems and the internal failures and problems within the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party has been essentially a clusterfuck for 50 years. And we'll talk about that next time. But yeah, so why is what I just said important? If you had a system of worker cooperatives, you would have more worker democracy. Yeah. You would have a more viable socialist, communist, anarchist, broader left-wing movement, because you would have people within worker cooperatives who would be more in tune democratically. They would have more local control. They would be far more democratically engaged, and they would largely be more engaged citizens as a result. Yeah. And as such, their interests will be aligned in actually like developing movements that could push the sort of federal leadership to be better and push them to the left. There's no way to push somebody like Biden to the left right now because the left movement doesn't exist as an organized mass, right? And, the sort of left in the United States post Bernie is, a bunch of different splinter groups but there's no broader sort of uniting popular front that existed like there was in the 1930s. Maybe some other time with another related book, we can go into why that popular front sort of existed and why it was successful. And then ultimately how it was undermined in the 1940s and 50s. But, the United States hasn't really had a large viable left since the 1930s. Right. So this is our chance. I mean, this is our chance to sort of change that, right? And so, regardless of your specific political orientation, Corey and I are different. You're an anarchist. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. But like that sort of broader umbrella that could sort of force these sort of short-term gains while we're fighting for the larger battles. Yeah. So worker cooperatives are a part of that. They're sort of a reform on the way to revolution. They're not a contradiction of a revolution. They're a part of it. Right. And so they're one way of us getting us there. And I think even if like at the very least, let's say we don't get the revolution right, like at the very least, I'm always hoping for evolution. I'm a revolutionary optimist. But if we don't, then at the very least, we will probably get a far more social democratic system where a lot of the harsher edges of capitalism are shaved off, and that gives us the energy to fight for more. Yeah. And so, this is an extremely short book. It's less than 200 pages. It's very, very easy to read. Richard Wolff has an incredibly very straightforward, easy to read style. He's very good at explaining big concepts. And he's fun to listen to. Like, he's just fun to listen to because he's like he's like this larger than life New Yorker. And so he has this large personality. And it carries through in the book and it carries through in what he does. So
I've listened to a number of interviews with him and some of his own videos too. And I always enjoy them, even if I don't entirely, grab onto what he's saying. I 100% enjoy and listening to what he's saying.
Yeah. And so, I'm pretty bullish on co-ops. I think they're a good thing. I think they're a model that we should move towards, because if worker ownership of the means of production is what socialism is, then worker cooperatives are one part of that. Absolutely. And so I think that, people should definitely check it out. It's through Haymarket Books. You can buy it through haymarketbooks.com if you don't want to give that bald fuck any more money. I highly recommend it. It's a great book. And not only will you learn about cooperatives, but you'll really get a great overview of like the economic and political history of the United States over the last 100 years.
Right.
He covers a lot of ground in a short amount of pages, but does it in a way that's not like hard to understand or overwhelming. I think he does a really great job of simplifying this to stuff and synthesizing this stuff to make it accessible for folks who aren't, who don't have a PhD in economics.
Right on. Okay. So, we're recommending this book.
Absolutely.
Definitely check it out.
It's, as Cornel West has a little blurb on the front of it, and he calls it required reading. Noam Chomsky has a nice blurb on the back. A New York Times Magazine calls Richard Wolff America's most prominent Marxist economist. I think that's true. Understanding Marxist economics is great because it gets you out of this sort of traditional paradigm of either like Keynesianism, which is sort of the main thread of the progressive liberal left in the United States or broadly, and then neoclassical economics or supply side or Reaganomics or neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it on the right. So, Marxist economics sort of breaks through that paradigm and gives you a different kind of model. So yeah, I definitely highly recommend the book. Definitely check it out.
Cool. Where can people find your content?
Sure. So I'm online at justinclark.org. You can follow me at JustinClarkPH on Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter. It's not good for my mental health to be on Twitter, so I'm not. I'll be having a forthcoming article on the friendship between Eugene Victor Debs, the American Socialist labor leader, and Robert Ingersoll, coming out in the Truth Seeker magazine sometime in the fall.
Very cool.
And then I work for the Indiana Historical Bureau. And so, definitely check out some of the work that we do at the Indiana History blog and Hoosier State Chronicles and all those related projects that I do for work. And then I'm also affiliated with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. If you're interested in learning more about sort of, Marxist theory or thinking about belonging to a political organization that has a Marxist orientation, the PSL is a great organization to get involved in, and you can learn more about them, I think, at pslweb.org. So, yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks again for another great review.
You're very, very welcome. And next time we'll be talking about Nixonland, the Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America by Rick Perlstein, which is the second volume in a 4-volume history of the rise of American conservatism in the 20th century. So we're going to be talking the late 1960s. We're going to be talking Nixon. We're going to be talking George McGovern. We're going to be talking radical revolutionaries fighting against the evils of the Vietnam War. And we're going to be talking Watergate. Cool. So we'll be talking all kinds of stuff history-wise next time.
Awesome. All right. I don't know about you, but I think I want to read that book, but that's impossible because I'm way too busy producing this show and my other shows. But now on to Anarchist Reading Corner. Okay, so Anarchist Reading Corner number 3. I'm on page 15 of The Anarchist Turn, and I'm going to start halfway down this page because I already read this first paragraph. So, set my timer. But in more contemporary words, the individual becomes such only through a process of socialization that begins immediately, at least with their very first encounters with language and the presence of other human beings. As psychoanalysis has shown, it is through such a process that the individual is led to internalize and assimilate the imaginary significations of that particular society they live in. To put it in Castoriadis' words, individuals are at the same time instituting and instituted by society. Society does not exist without the individuals that constantly create and recreate it. But at the same time, individuals only exist as a product of society itself. But if individuals are at the same time instituting and instituted, if, to use Bakunin's phrase, individuals are nothing but the society that individualizes itself in them, they cannot be free unless everybody else is free. Hence also the importance of the notion of the recognition in Bakunin. For the individual to be free means to be recognized, considered and treated as such by another individual, and by all the individuals that surround him. In order to recognize freedom, you need the mediation of the imaginary significations of society. Freedom implies recognition to be recognized and to recognize the other as free. Masters who do not recognize the freedom of their slaves are, for this very reason, themselves not free. In this way, they contribute to perpetuating the image of slavery in society of which they are a part. And this very slavery will come back to them in one form or another, as Malatesta puts it by quoting Bakunin. No man can achieve his own emancipation without at the same time working for the emancipation of all men around him. My freedom is the freedom of all, since I am not truly free in thought and in fact, except when my freedom and my rights are confirmed and approved in the freedom and rights of all men, who are my equals. It matters to me very much what other men are, because however interdependent I may appear to be or think I am, because of my social position, were I Pope, Tsar, Emperor, or even Prime Minister, I remain always the product of what the humblest among them are. If they are ignorant, poor, slaves, my existence is determined by their slavery. I, an enlightened or intelligent man, am, for instance, in the event rendered stupid by their stupidity. As a courageous man, I am enslaved by their slavery. As a rich man, I tremble before their poverty. As a privileged person, I blanch at their justice. I, who want to be free, cannot be, because all the men around me do not yet want to be free, and consequently, they become tools of oppression against me. It is a very radical idea of freedom, but one that, if read in light of more recent developments, is today more timely than ever before. Back to freedom beyond autonomy. In sum, freedom is inevitably a freedom of equals, because I cannot be free if everybody else around me is not free. Or, which is the same, if I do not have both the material and the cognitive means to realize my freedom. We are imbued with the customs, ideas, and images that dominate our society. Human beings are not independent selves that, like billiard balls, collide with each other on green bays. They are bodies that are instituting and instituted by the society in which they live. There are two main consequences that follow from such a view. Let me briefly illustrate them. The first is that however abstract this view may appear, it can only be realized in a very concrete way. It is not by chance that Bakunin calls it a materialist conception of freedom, and opposes it to the idealistic one. If freedom is to be realized not just by a separate self, which does not exist, but also through society, it follows that an entire reorganization of society is necessary for its realization. For Bakunin, this implies a restructuring of society from below, according to the principle of free association and federation. But why is it so? Free federalism follows from a view of freedom articulated in three moments. The first, Bakunin says, is the positive and social moment, and consists in the development of all human faculties and potentialities through education and material well-being. All things that can only be acquired through the physical and intellectual work of the whole society. It is a view very close to Marx's positive conception of freedom, according to which freedom does not consist in the negative capacity to avoid this or that, but in the positive power to develop our potentialities. The second moment for the realization of free federalism is instead more negative. Bakunin calls it the moment of the revolt. It is the revolt against every authority, human or divine. First and foremost, it is a revolt against God, because, in Bakunin's words, as long as we have a master in the sky, we will not be free on earth. At times, Bakunin seems to have a very traditional idea of God, but I think we can extend his thought to all forms of transcendent authority. If we believe that we owe a divine authority unconditional obedience, we are necessarily slaves to it, as well as to its intermediaries, such as ministers, prophets, or messiahs. This is the reason why Bakunin strongly criticized nationalism as a new form of political theology. By presenting the nation as a transcendent being to which unconditional obedience is due just because it is our supposed fatherland, nationalists such as Giuseppe Mazzini have replaced a god in the sky with another one on earth. We begin here to see why Bakunin's notion of freedom, despite its Hegelian origins, goes well beyond Hegel. Far from celebrating the nation-state as the culminating point of ethical life, Bakunin calls for its elimination as a new form of political theology. The revolt against God and transcendent authority must indeed be combined with the revolt against specifically human authority. Here Bakunin introduces a fine distinction between the legal and formal authority of the state, what he calls the tyranny of society. The revolt against the first is easier because the enemy can effortlessly be identified. But the revolt against the second is much more complicated because, to a large extent, we are its products. Society, as we have seen, exercises its tyranny through customs, traditions, sentiments, prejudices, images, and habits, on both our material and intellectual life. Part of its influence is natural, and we cannot escape it. However, part of it is not. Bakunin seems to believe that education and scientific knowledge is sufficient to this end, but I believe we have more grounds today to be skeptical about it. Knowledge is not enough. Knowledge does not liberate from power, because it is itself power. The production of scientific knowledge is no exception to the tyranny of society, because as Michel Foucault has shown us, it may even be the chief means for the domestication of revolt and the creation of compliant subjects. Natural and social sciences, such as chemistry, demography, and sociology, have all proved to be potential means to discipline and domesticate human beings rather than to liberate them. Where to start from then? Where to get liberation from the subtle tyranny? Where to start from then? Where to get liberation from the subtle tyranny that society exercises through its customs, traditions, and sentiments? Here, I believe, enters the more radical interpretation of federalism. The old anarchist motto, multiply your associations and be free, can indeed be seen as a multiplication of both the political and also the social and imaginary ties people are subjected to. By entering into context with different social imaginaries and expanding our knowledge to different regimes of truth, it is possible to find a moment of friction where the tyranny of society breaks down. As I will try to show, it is here that, particularly today, the possibility of freedom lies. Before I do so, let me briefly illustrate the second main consequence of this conception of freedom as freedom of equals. Recovering this view today is an implicit invitation to go beyond freedom understood as autonomy. There are many possible definitions of autonomy, but the most important, because it is the most influential, is that which goes back to its etymology. Autonomy literally means autos, nomos, to give the law to oneself. From this original meaning, and through the influence of philosophers like Rousseau and Kant, the term came to mean self-determination, more generally as if every determination would be a subjection to the law, which I believe is far from being the case. I cannot discuss here the details of the historical path of the concept of autonomy, but let me just briefly mention the deep influence that it has exercised on liberal and democratic thought until very, very recently. Of course, the concept of autonomy has not been immune from criticism. The most obvious is that it presupposes a self that actually gives a law to itself. As we have already suggested, this assumption is far from being unquestioned. Furthermore, the idea of the separate self is an assumption that inevitably leads to what we may call limitative view of freedom. If we believe that human beings are self-enclosed selves endowed with autonomy, the problem necessarily becomes that restricting such autonomy in order to make space for the autonomy of others, like the billiard balls colliding on green bays, the freedoms of individuals are deemed to conflict with one another. And the problem inevitably becomes that of limiting them. On the contrary, if we assume that we are the product of the society we live in, a completely different perspective emerges. The problem is no longer how to limit freedom, but rather how to enhance it. In other words, the imperative is no longer limit freedom so that everybody can enjoy it, but rather create it because it might not be there yet. Different interventions have addressed the problem of autonomy and have certainly brought the discussion much further than where modern liberal thinking had left it. Yet, as I shall now try to argue, focusing on autonomy is misleading. Autonomy may also be an important condition for freedom, but it is only one part of it. You cannot be free without being autonomous, but being autonomous does not automatically mean being free. This particularly emerges if we consider that the contrary of autonomy is heteronomy. Heteronomy? Okay. A condition where people are given the law by somebody else, whereas the opposite of freedom is domination, something that can occur in ways other than simply being given the law by somebody else. The tyranny of society can take place in many different ways, which go well beyond law-giving, and include even self-oppression and voluntary servitude. In some, freedom and autonomy are conceptually speaking only partially overlapping. To sum up, to be autonomous does not yet mean to be free. But it is not just a terminological issue. It is a question of conceptual clarity that has crucial consequences on the practice of freedom. For instance, many autonomist movements may give rise to utopian communities, based on the principle of autonomy understood as the main road for the realization of freedom. Let us admit for the moment that we could still realize completely autonomous communities in our globalizing world. The question is, are the people living in such communities really free? My impression is that they are possibly autonomous in the sense of being materially independent from the outside, but by no means free and perhaps not even self-determined. If you live in a self-imposed ghetto, separated from the rest of the world, you are not free because you cannot live where you want, but you are not even self-determined because your choice to live in that particular community is imposed by some external factors. To conclude on this point, the critics of the concept of freedom, such as Goodman, who argue that freedom is a cumbersome metaphysical concept, are perhaps right. Autonomy is a much thinner and therefore at least apparently easier to realize. However, they are also wrong because they do not realize that it is a burden that we have to take on if we want to avoid the self-imposed ghetto of autonomy. I've got 5 seconds left, so I think I'll stop there so that next time I can do black and red reciprocal antidotes. Thanks so much for listening to this segment of the Anarchist Reading Corner, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying reading this book with you. That's the end. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work so that I don't have to do as many hours working gig jobs. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. Or if you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. Or liking, commenting, or sharing the show is always helpful. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcorey. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which includes Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, and From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics. My Twitter is @skepticallefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/cjbrainstorm. I do accept most friend requests. You can also send me an email at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and let's do a new tagline. Let's call it No Gods, No Masters, No Bullshit.